Good evening and welcome to the Jubilee Room in New South Wales Parliament House. I'm Chris Uhlmann and you're watching New South Wales Votes. My guests this evening are the Premier Mike Baird and the Opposition Leader Luke Foley. Good evening. Mike Baird, first to you, why should you continue to lead New South Wales?
Well, Chris, we've outlined over the past few months very positive plans for the state, and they include building, finally, the roads, the rail, the schools, the hospital that we desperately need. And we also, in that plan, will grow over 100,000 jobs. What we've shown, I believe, is a track record of delivery, very different to what we had under Labor. They promised a lot in terms of infrastructure, but never delivered, and they had the economy running dead last. And if you look at our track record, we are the ones that have delivered. Indeed, we said that we would take the economy from last, what we inherited from Labor, back to leading the nation. It is. We said we'd start the North West Rail Link. We have. We'd build the South West Rail Link. We have. And in addition, we'd start one of the major motorways, and we've started all three. So we want the opportunity to continue the work we have and to deliver the infrastructure that makes a difference to people's daily lives.
Well, Luke Foley, after only 4 years in opposition, why should Labor be returned to power?
Well, Chris, Labor's priorities are to keep the electricity network in public hands and to invest in the schools and hospitals of tomorrow. The future of the state's electricity network is on the line at this election. Its future will be decided almost certainly for once and for all. Labor believes the publicly owned electricity network that sends power to every household and business in this state should remain in public hands. It returned $1.7 billion last year to the state budget to pay for nurses, teachers, police and paramedics. We think that should continue. I've put an additional $3 billion on the table for investment in our schools and hospitals, $1 billion more than the Liberals and Nationals, and we'll invest in the schools and hospitals of the future without selling our electricity network.
But the electricity network, and you've spoken about this a lot during the course of this election campaign, under the privatisations we saw in South Australia and Victoria, prices rose no more rapidly there than they have in New South Wales. In fact, New South Wales networks are among the most expensive in the country.
Well, Chris, the per unit price of electricity, cents per kilowatt hour, comparing apples with apples, a Frontier Economics report to the Department of Premier and Cabinet last October revealed that the cost of electricity per unit is lower in New South Wales and Queensland, where the networks are publicly owned, than in Victoria and South Australia, where they're privately owned. That's an apples with apples comparison. But if you want to talk raw prices, the average electricity bill in South Australia, $2,388, $2,101 in New South Wales.
And lower in Victoria.
Yes, and in Victoria, what we see is an electricity network far smaller than in New South Wales, half the size. It's more expensive to run the network.
You've got one that's quite large, a lot larger with a lot fewer people, so you're not comparing apples with apples at all.
Well, I'll compare apples with apples, as Frontier Economics did to the Department of Premier and Cabinet, around 28 cents per kilowatt hour in the publicly owned states of New South Wales and Queensland, and over 30 cents per kilowatt hour in Victoria and South Australia.
Mike Baird, this is a big risk for you, isn't it? If you can't sell this network, you don't have a transport plan, you don't have money to spend on the things that you want.
Well, I mean, let's just clear up a couple of things we heard there. I mean, that Frontier Economics report, the Leader Opposition is talking about, also said that there was no evidence at all that this put upward pressure on prices, indeed quite the contrary. And he is quite isolated on this, because it's not just me, it's both that report, it's the ACCC, I mean Rod Sims, it's people like Tom Perry, ex-IPART, it's Paul Keating, Martin Ferguson. I mean, Martin Ferguson came out today and said he was ashamed of New South Wales Labor for this dishonest campaign. The facts show that the bills in South Australia and Victoria are lower when private sector has come in. And we maintain, I mean, our plan, we maintain public ownership, and we just lease out 49%, and then we put that into new assets, and we own both.
But the facts show that people believe Luke Foley and not you when it comes to what might happen to electricity prices.
Well, the Leader of the Opposition has to answer the dishonest campaign that is being run. I mean, that campaign is not true. He knows it's not true. All the independent experts say it's not true, and he has to answer for that.
Luke Foley?
Well, this is the policy now that dare not speak its name. Mike's been spruiking privatisation of electricity since the month he became Premier. A week ago he switched to saying, oh, everything will stay in public ownership. There's 4 state-owned electricity businesses on the line here. Transgrid, the transmission network, he'll sell 100%. 2 of the 3 distributors, he'll sell majority control. That is a privatisation, but he can't and won't call it a privatisation anymore, having said it's his signature policy for the first 9 months, 10 months of his premiership. It's now the policy that he runs away from.
But what's so terrifying about privatisation? Why did you sell the state-owned coal mines? Why did you sell the TAB? No one's complaining about that now.
Well, I've said from day one of my leadership, Chris, I'm not an ideologue. For me, what matters is what works. Now, we're talking about the monopoly part of the network. You can't run 2 sets of poles and wires down every street in your state. You can only have one. It's a licence to print money.
Well, I mean, there is a couple of factors there. The Leader of the Opposition was against the lease of the port, indeed voted against it in Parliament, and then he became Leader and said he's for it. Now, I don't know what other port he's going to put alongside Port Botany, but the concept's the same. You know, that is a monopoly that has regulatory oversight, exactly the same. So we have a position here that's most important. He knows that the campaign on prices is dishonest, as does all of his colleagues and as does the experts. And what we are doing is putting downward pressure on prices. We are taking the rent up front and we're actually building all of that infrastructure I outlined. That's the difference.
So you can't get that through the upper house? Say that you can't, then you don't have a transport plan, you don't have $20 billion.
Well, we are very confident because we are going to the election. It's quite different because Labor, before the last election, said they're actually against any form of electricity privatisation. Then they spent 4 years selling retailers. They then sold generators. They sold waste management businesses. So all of a sudden this epiphany that's being put forward by the Leader of the Opposition, they say one thing before the election and do the exact opposite afterwards. And we have done exactly what we said we'd do, and that's what we're doing here.
Sure, but just to establish this point, though, if you should game government and want to sell these assets and can't get this through the upper house, then you don't have the money that you say you have for all your other plans.
Well, my expectation is we will. I mean, for the past 20 years, no government has controlled the upper house in this place, including the term we just went through. And we put forward significant reform, our agenda, and we've got it through. And my expectation is the same would come again. We're being honest with the people of New South Wales. This is our plan, but the thing about the plan is it's a benefit. So there's a benefit in electricity prices, but just as importantly, the schools, the rail, the hospitals, all of these things that we desperately need, well, they're funded. And that is such a difference to what we saw for 16 years under Labor.
We saw Victoria sell its electricity assets. We saw Victoria clear its debt, put itself in a good financial position. And yet, at every chance that the Labor Party has had for this, and the price has been high and is gradually diminishing, you've missed that opportunity. Aren't you now missing another opportunity for New South Wales?
No, Chris, State Labor's been consistent here on the essential monopoly part of the network, that it belongs in public hands.
Which is regulated.
It's a licence to print money.
It's regulated whether it's public or it's private, isn't it? It is regulated.
It is. And I'm backing the regulator right now with her draft determination to drive down costs, to decrease people's power prices, and the Liberals are appealing her draft determination. Now, the monopoly part of the network returns $1.7 billion to the state budget that helps fund nurses, teachers and police.
And if the network is more efficiently run, then that money will be liberated into the economy.
And it can and will be run very efficiently if this regulator's decision, if her draft determination gets up. That's why I'm backing her.
One last point on this.
Well, I think the point then becomes, Chris, if that's what the Leader of the Opposition is saying, then if we undertake the lease, what we will see is lower prices over the next 5 years. Is that the case or not? Because that's what the regulator said.
I don't accept that. In Victoria and South Australia, prices went up. Victoria has the highest retail margins in the country, Mike.
But you're backing the regulator, so the regulator sets the price for the next 5 years. If a lease is undertaken, will prices go up?
She sets the network charges.
Yeah,
the retail prices, you deregulated the retail prices.
So will network prices...
They can charge what they like.
Well, network prices... networks at the moment. The networks are regulated.
Will the network prices go over the next 5 years?
Yeah, and you're going to sell it for at least 99 years. You're giving a guarantee for 4 or 5 years. I'm talking about 99 years minimum, finally, in reality forever.
Finally on this, Mike Baird, if you sell 49%, why not sell 100%? You will eventually. If you get away with selling 49%, you will sell the other 51%, won't you?
No, I won't. No, I've been very clear on this. I've said...
Well, if you got a good price for it, why wouldn't you do it? If it's such a great thing, why do you only do half of it?
Well, as I've said, 49%, I believe in competitive tension, and I also believe that will secure the best outcome for the state. We maintained 51%, and The nonsense being put around about dividends is not correct. Indeed, if the Leader of the Opposition had read the budget, he would know that those dividends get down to $268 million during the current estimate period.
Well, you won't get a decent price for the asset if its profits are disappearing. You won't be able to sell it for anything near $13 billion if you're right on the dividends, Mike.
So what you have is actually the truthful position. We maintain 51%. That is the position we'll be retaining, full stop, end of story. And what has been missed by the opposition, we grow the economy by $300 billion, over 100,000 jobs. That means more revenue, not less, come to the state, and we get the infrastructure that we desperately need.
OK, so a lot of the focus in this has been on infrastructure and on transport. So how are you going to fund your plan for transport? Where will the money come from? OK,
we've outlined 6 weeks from election day an additional $10.05 billion contribution to the state's infrastructure spend, in addition to the annual spend that's currently running at $15 billion. And we've put on the table how we'll fund that. It's been costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. There's funds there already, and we'll defer the abolition of 3 existing business stamp duty taxes. Mike's already deferred the abolition of those stamp duty taxes once in 2013 because of budget circumstances. I wish I didn't have to do this, but with Tony Abbott cutting $25 billion from our state's schools and hospitals over the next decade, I have to make that tough decision.
And when it gets to the end of that period of time, you will guarantee that you will remove those taxes?
We've said we'll defer the abolition for 10 years. I hope one day we'll have a Prime Minister who gives New South Wales a fair share for our schools and hospitals. And if Tony Abbott gave us a fair share, we could abolish those 3 business stamp duty taxes tomorrow.
Aren't you just taxing jobs, though? Isn't that the effect of business taxes?
No, we're not. Labor consistently in office reduced the payroll tax burden. My first policy announced as leader was a big tax cut for the racing industry because Victoria and Queensland have done the same. We'll always seek to keep businesses here competitive when it comes to taxes.
Mike Baird, go on, sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the problem with that is you just outlined over $5 billion in new taxes to businesses, and as you say, that slows the economy. I mean, that's why the New South Wales economy was last when we came to power, and it's now leading the nation because we have taken those costs out.
They're not new taxes, they're existing taxes that Mike once has deferred the abolition of. And if Mike went to his good mate Tony Abbott and got him to reverse his unfair $25 billion of cuts to our schools and hospitals, we could abolish those stamp duty taxes tomorrow. I'd like to do it.
If you look at that, though, and let's now move to health and to hospitals in particular, you look at your budget, 28% of it now goes on health. The lion's share of that is on hospitals. The Commonwealth is withdrawing funding from hospitals, not just in this year and the next. It has reneged on a deal which will see its share of your hospital expenditure drop from 26% to 13% between now and 2050. You can't afford that burden, can you?
No, we can't.
And he's supposed to be your friend.
No, we can't. And I've been upfront from the day that budget decision was made. And I have said that both publicly and privately to the Prime Minister and the federal government.
And you haven't moved him at all yet, have you?
Well, no, what we've agreed is that it'll be part of the white paper discussion on federalism and taxation. And it needs to be, because if you look at the long-term finances of the state, the health budget is the biggest expense, growing at the fastest rate. We don't have the growth taxes. The Commonwealth Government does, which is why we've argued we can't do that alone. So it needs to be done together, and it is something I've argued from day one and I'll argue all the way through.
You've seen the federal government's intergenerational report, and you would have seen in that the federal government has factored in those cuts all the way through to 2054. Now, I'm not saying Tony Abbott's going to be there then, but that's the way the Commonwealth intends to save money, by passing these costs on to the states.
Yeah, and I don't accept that. And that's something that I will be charging forward very strongly on if I'm given the opportunity to lead beyond March. I'm actually chairing the Premiers and First Ministers this year, if given the opportunity to continue, and that is agenda item number 1. And it needs to be brought together. But I think, Chris, the important point is I've shown I can deliver outcomes for the people of this state. That's my focus. And the former federal Labor government, well, I negotiated as Treasurer, together with the former Premier, the first state to sign up to the Gonski reforms, the first state to sign up to NDIS. So I will work with whatever government, and my main focus is to ensure that I get outcomes, not megaphone diplomacy, outcomes to the people of New South Wales, and that's what I'll do day in, day out.
Luke Foley, how do you afford hospitals? Because it's not going to be any different if you're in government.
Well, what we're promising is an additional $1.7 billion to build and upgrade hospitals. That's more than what Mike's committing to, which is $1 billion. So $700 million more, and mine comes unconditionally. I won't sell the electricity network. If he can't sell the electricity network, he can't deliver any of that additional investment. I think Mike missed an opportunity 3 or 4 weeks ago when Tony Abbott's job was on the line. The South Australian Liberals, some of them, tied their vote, their ongoing support for Tony Abbott, to investment in South Australia, defence contracts and so on. I thought Mike had a golden opportunity as a popular Liberal Premier from Tony Abbott's home state to tie his ongoing support for Mr Abbott to a reversal of some of those very unfair
But there's a
cuts.
problem in hospitals that's going to outlive any Prime Minister, and that is we're spending more now on people over the last decade, twice as much in every single age group in hospitals. It's not just the ageing of the population. As medical technology changes, how do you afford that into the future? And it's going to be a problem no matter who's in charge in the federal government.
Yeah, it's an enormous challenge for whoever is in power. We're putting more dollars on the table at this election to build and upgrade hospitals. We're committing to more nurses, more ambulance officers.
A ratio which once was said was a blunt instrument by your own party.
Well, new leader, new policies, new priorities, delivering the nurses we need.
If you have ratios, that means you don't believe you'll ever find
departments.
efficiencies in the hospital system.
Well, there's always a search for efficiencies. There's always a search for efficiencies, and they're delivered. But $18 billion of cuts to our hospitals in New South Wales from Liberal governments in Sydney and Canberra hurt the system. That's why we've seen at the Nepean birthing unit 21 fewer staff. Women can't give birth there.
One final point on this?
Well, again, Labor just have to be truthful about this. I mean, funding has gone up by 20% since we've come to power. So it's $15.5 billion to over $18 billion. And why is that important? Because we believe in the public health system. And the scare campaign that's been run against the public health system is irresponsible. It has got no substance, and we have delivered more funding. And the reason that's important, because we're helping our nurses and doctors on the front line to help those across the state who are obviously sick and vulnerable. Now, the important point is we've put many more nurses. We committed to do 2,600 nurses, but as we've got the budget under control, we put more, over 3,400 additional nurses. So there's record funding going in, there's record amount of infrastructure. Indeed, we've spent more in our first term than the previous Labor government did over 16 years.
Wait a minute. I mean, Dr Brian Owler from the AMA said, with an ageing population and the great expense involved with new medical technology, anything less than 7% growth constantly, year in, year out, in the health budget is in effect a cut. In Labor's final years, the budget was growing by 7% a year. Under Mike as Treasurer and Premier, it's growing at 4% a year. Brian Owler says that's an effective cut to health.
At what point does Brian Owler say that at 7% a year eventually it's going to consume the entire budget of New South Wales?
That's the great challenge. That's why we need a fair
share. He hasn't got an answer for it, and neither of you at the moment, or have you, Premier, to that great challenge for New South Wales?
Well, I think we've shown it. It's actually 5.2% that we've put in the last 2 years into the health system, so not the 4% that the opposition said.
Less than 7
and we're continuing to put more in. I mean, what you see is we made a commitment in terms of nurses, we put much more, and as we get that budget flexibility, and that's why it's so important that you actually drive the economy, because if the economy is growing with more jobs and investment, there's more revenue to government, we can put more into services and infrastructure.
In education, you've got the same problem, really, haven't you? It's 14% of your budget. You signed up to a federal government plan, the Gonski plan, which was going to see more money come from the Commonwealth. Again, Tony Abbott has reneged on that plan, and now that means that either you have to find that money or try again to convince him, perhaps as agenda item number 2 at the meeting that you're chairing, to put some more money up.
Well, it will be, and there's no change in agreement from us. I mean, we've signed up to 6 years, and we will meet that commitment.
And the reason won't.
Well, we have signed up to 6 years, and that's exactly what you see. The Commonwealth has signed up to 4 years. I mean, so there's over the next 4 years. I expect to see significant results from education that will be part of the basis that we'll be lobbying for the continuation of that funding. And the difference it's made, I mean, we've made announcements this week in terms of additional 25% increase in school counsellors, a historic investment in school counsellors, a capacity for our primary school teachers to finally have a mentoring time so they can get the best teachers in the school to give our kids the greatest opportunity they can. And That's the difference. You control the budget, you've got a capacity to make those sort of investments in health and education, which is what we've done, and we're very proud of that.
And Luke Foley, on all of these things, again, they're problems that will face any government in New South Wales, not just whether it's run by Mike Baird, but also by you.
That is true, but let's look at what happened on Gonski. The parents and the kids of New South Wales have lost out twice. In Mike's first budget as Treasurer, the school's capital budget was cut by 42%, from 630 million to 360, and he said that's because the feds will cover it through Gonski. But then Mr Abbott reneged on Gonski. The funding that was cut from the state hasn't been reintroduced. We're $1 billion behind, and with the feds pulling the rug from under us on Gonski.
I mean, it's just, what he's talking about is actually a reduction of the BER money that came in on the back of the stimulus spend. So he's confusing two issues on the budget. Our spend has been increased, and our commitment in terms of Gonski is historic. I mean, we have put in record funding that's making a difference on the ground, and it importantly is giving some of our most disadvantaged youth across the state the same level of funding they've been crying out for a long time.
Let's move on to housing affordability, and you put forward a plan to try and spread out the payments on stamp duty across 5 years. Have you ever seen a plan where people gave first home buyers money that wasn't inflationary, that money essentially drives up the price of houses?
I accept your premise. That's why we're not giving people money. We're not increasing first homeowners grants because there is an inflationary effect. I concede that. What we've said is people will still be required to pay their stamp duty. It's an important source of revenue to the state. You make the very correct point that state budgets are under enormous pressure. We can't drastically reduce or abolish stamp duty, an important source of revenue to the state. We've said we'll allow first home buyers to pay it off via monthly instalments in a HECS-style scheme, if you like, up to 60 months, 5 years. We think that will assist giving people a leg up in the most expensive housing market in the country here in Sydney.
And it is the most expensive housing market in the country, and it's a supply side problem, isn't it? And why aren't you releasing enough land to keep pace with housing formation?
Well, we're doing exactly that, Chris, and I think in terms of...
It's not keeping pace, though, is it?
No, and we have to do more, but I think the stamp duty plan that's been put forward by Labor, I mean, it shows how they're running policy in this campaign. I mean, that was rejected by Michael Egan, the former Treasurer, that said the scheme didn't work, and it does exactly what you articulated, and that is by discounting stamp duty up front, it naturally will increase the prices of the houses, and that's what the evidence has shown. And we are about actually trying to solve it long term, which is getting supply going. And when we came in, it was at 50-year lows, but we now have it back at 20-year highs. So we're finally getting housing going, and 50,000 approvals last 12 months versus just over 20,000.
Let's move outside the city for a moment. Why aren't you both championing coal seam gas? In the long run, it's going to be a much cleaner source of energy than coal is. It clearly is an energy source of the future. It'll be a transitional source between what we've got now and renewables. So, Luke Foley, why aren't we making a bigger deal of that? Why doesn't New South Wales do more on coal seam gas?
Well, there is a role for gas in the state's energy future, but we must protect our prime agricultural land, we must protect our water resources, we must protect our biodiversity. And I'm guided by the Chief Scientist's report, her 16 recommendations.
You could go ahead.
We've said, let's hit the pause button until all 16 of her recommendations are implemented in full. The industry should not proceed until and unless all of her recommendations are implemented in full.
Coal seam gas, surely it is an energy source of the future for New South Wales, a revenue source of the future for New South Wales. Your Chief Scientist says that it can go ahead with the proper protections.
Well, and the Chief Scientist is an important point, because when we came in, Chris, we inherited what was left behind, which was a mess, and that was licences like confetti across the state. There was no protections, no regulations, and that obviously has created fear amongst the community, and we have been dealing with that mess since we've come in, and our gas plan shows that it is working. We're not issuing any new licences. Indeed, we're buying them back, and we're buying them back from where they were, and we're doing it in the context of without having to pay compensation, in the sense of ripping up contracts. We're negotiating directly in terms of the compensation, which is the right thing to do. And importantly, that's not going to go ahead until we get the protections in place, both in terms of all of the Chief Scientist's recommendations, and it then can go ahead with the community's support in the right areas under the right regulatory regime.
In order to do tough things in government, you need to have the trust of the people. And one of the things that has been battered in New South Wales, now under two governments, under a Labor government and under a coalition government is trust. How do the people in New South Wales trust either of your parties now after what they've seen in ICAC?
Look, I accept the premise of your question. The last 8 years has not instilled confidence in our state political system as far as the people of this state are concerned. I have a record. I campaigned for many a long year to prohibit donations from property developers in New South Wales politics. I was delighted when in the dying days of the former government that was adopted. We've committed to the highest integrity standards for MPs in any party, in any parliament in Australia. There's more to be done. That's why I support an independent body being established to oversee and make decisions about public funding to our political parties.
Mike Baird, after what people saw in the Labor years, they must hang their heads after seeing what happened with your government.
I mean, we let them down, Chris. I mean, I'm not going to put it any other way. And I think the community expects much more than what it saw roll out of ICAC over the past weeks, months and years. But I can assure you, Chris, I am determined for a zero-tolerance approach. And I think that's what you've seen from me since I've had the privilege of being Premier of this state, and we need to do more on that. And we have outlined new disclosure in terms of ministerial diaries. We've put donation reform front and centre, and I try to take the politics out of it and get the experts to look at it and give us the recommendations, which is exactly what we've done. And we need to do more. So we're doing everything possible to restore that trust.
Speaking of taking the politics out of things, tax reform, it's something that you will face as leaders, as the federal government's going to have a tax white paper. Should the GST be reformed in order to give you the kind of money that you need to do? You need to do two things. You need to make cuts in your budget in order to make it add up in the future, but you're also going to need to find revenue, aren't you? Should the GST be reformed to broaden the base or lift the rate?
Well, I mean, the federal government has ruled that out. So, I mean, that's no longer a discussion.
If you get the support of you and every other state premier, it'll go ahead.
No, well, what we will have is a constructive discussion on tax reform, and that is anticipated this year. And clearly the federal government has put some issues around this now, and I anticipate playing a constructive role in that tax reform if I continue in the job beyond March.
Luke Foley?
Well, I won't be supporting an increase in the rate or the reach of the GST when people are doing it tough. I just won't support that.
So there's no chance of tax reform, it would appear, from any of the states at the way we're going at the moment?
We can talk constructively to a federal government that gives us our fair share in the first place, and, you know, those massive cuts, $25 billion of cuts from the Abbott hockey budget to New South Wales schools and hospitals hurt. Put those back, then there can be constructive dialogue, whether Mike's Premier or I am, with the federal government.
Finally, Mike Baird, Tony Abbott, he's a friend of yours, but he hasn't been particularly friendly when it comes to New South Wales.
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister has acknowledged, as has the federal government, they've gone through a tough time. But, I mean, this election is about the future of this state. I mean, we have put forward a positive plan that actually delivers infrastructure. Remember, under Labor, they promised, didn't deliver. We have it, and we should be very frightened. I mean, their plan, not funded, not costed. It's back to old Labor. We have a plan to actually take this state forward and deliver.
But when you look at the swings and roundabouts of what the federal government's done to you, it's taken more money out than it's putting in.
Well, no, the federal government is undoubtedly, on the infrastructure space, putting more money in, and indeed...
and taking it out of health and education.
Well, and that's an issue that we need to address, there's no doubt about it. But this election, Chris, is about who has the best plan to take this state forward, to keep the economy at number one, to build what we need in terms of schools, roads, rail, and that makes a difference to people's lives, and that's what I'm running on.
Very briefly.
Well, we need a Premier who's not a rubber stamp for a federal Prime Minister and government, who'll stand up and fight for the fair share for this state. That's what I'll be.
Luke Foley, thank you very much. Mike Baird, thank you very much. May the best argument win on election day in less than 14 days' time. And that's it from us from here for tonight. Thank you.